Good morning, everybody. I will try not to bore you for the next 30 minutes that I have. I would not like to get too much into specific technologies, but I would like to take the chance to take a step back and paint a bigger picture, because I think the big picture is important for any innovator to see where is my role in playing a part in a big transformation. So bear with me. The title is What Comes After the Car? Do I know? No. But I think there is plenty of indicators that things are not just changing, they're being completely disrupted. And there's a few hints that I would like to give in the course of the presentation. I'll take you through my thesis, some background information, argument, and maybe an outlook in the future. Who am I? Well, I've loved cars since I was very small. In fact, that is me. I've been in the car industry, but I'm not a car guy. So that allows me to go back and to say what is good and what is not good. I'm an architect by training, and architects are creative. So part of that I try to apply when I worked in the industry, but I see the industry is changing so fast, and the big corporations are not always as fast as the change that needs to happen. So getting out and doing your own thing seems like the best thing one can possibly do at this point in time. So mid-career change, excellent. Now discovering many new fields, new partners, also partners here in Vilnius with a cool startup called Rider, who we are trying to now figure out an excellent way of growing into this change. My first car, useless, the biggest tragedy in my life, but it was still fun. And I ended up at AMG that produces, as you might know, heavy cars with big engines and lots of noise. And that, if I may say, is not the future. So let me start with a thesis. The thesis is mobility has been always the primary driver of shaping human civilization in terms of built infrastructure, in terms of creating a world environment. It started with separated settlements. It was shaped around interaction, needing to get from one place to the other. Governments obviously used it to move their troops, to colonize, and to actually move into territories. But it became part of culture, became part of the freedom we have and the sense of place. We create buildings around marketplaces. The marketplaces are places of interaction and commerce. That's obvious. The next one. Where did it start? It didn't start inside the land. It started very often around water, because way back, water was how we moved from A to B. It was easy. We didn't need to go through the jungles. We didn't need to go through the mud or the snow. We actually took a boat and we just moved around. And this pattern is not trivial. And I'm not trying to bring it up because it doesn't matter, but on the contrary, it actually matters very much. And if you look at a lot of the population, about 40% of those people living on this planet are within a rim of some coastline. That is significant. It's significant in many ways because the whole debate about environmental change will affect those cities. Not all 40% of people live right on the coast, but enough so that cities are worried and something needs to be done. And then we have the roads. The roads, of course, took people from the coast into the cities. And us, as Europeans, we've been influenced by the Romans. The Roman road system is still massively important for how our cities are organized in Europe and how our big streets are connecting one city and one province to the next. Bridges were built, which of course became bigger and bigger, which started enabling people to move across boundaries. And we will see exactly the same pattern again with new mobility. We're now building new bridges that allow us to get across boundaries. And, interesting, it created a network of little towns. And once I was in a lecture, and somebody said, did you ever notice that, and this was in England, the market towns are about 30 kilometers away from one another. Why? Because you could walk 30 kilometers, sell your goods, and walk back. So there was a pattern in the whole infrastructure of our countries that was based on what was the ability for people to move, interact, do commerce, get exchange, get goods, and how did that affect our pattern of development. And this is one example of wool trading somewhere in England called Chipping Campden Market. And then came technology, locomotive, early times. We think, well, you know, black and white photography, it looks old, was heavy, but it was a disruptor. It was an absolute disrupting technology that then moved the frontier of what people could actually explore and how fast they could move. And if you take the most prominent example, the United States of America was colonized essentially because of the locomotive. They managed to get goods, people, wares across from the East Coast to the West Coast, and that allowed cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and others to even flourish. And if you look at the figures of the amount of kilometers of rail that were built during this time, it is flabbergasting. And then we look at London. London only grew as it did because it grew along the lines of the railways. And it connected villages. The villages grew together, and the city essentially expanded in the 19th century from being the world's biggest city at the time, with about 1 million, to one of the biggest cities, and the biggest city in Europe, with more than 8 million inhabitants. And this growth was not only because of the railways. You have to imagine when you walk through European cities that every city that has stucco on the walls was built by the help of horse carriages. This is a primitive technology if we look at it now, but these are the cities we live in now. They were just built from the ground. London, Paris under Haussmann, Vilnius, everywhere you have stucco, you are still in the age of the horse. And the horse carriage was the means of transportation. There were about 50,000 horses in London alone in the 19th century, before the advent of the car. They produced 650,000 kilograms of waste in the city every single day. 50,000 liters of urine. I'm just saying this in this detail because actually you think it wasn't so nice. The population at the time of 1900, when the car started coming, was already 4.5 million. London was drowning in horses. So horses were not pleasant as they are now. If you go to Vienna, you get a little horse carriage, take your romantic partner for a little midnight tour around the city. No. This is what London looked like. It was noisy, it was stinky, and it was difficult still. And then, in this growth phase where things started to collapse, some Germans came up and developed what was later called the automobile. But before we get to that, I want to throw at you a very simple model of what hundreds, actually thousands of years of mobility created in the modern world. It starts with a carriage. The carriage was obviously used, there we go, for goods, but it was used for people. And the carriage for people became more and more luxurious, comfortable. And we have two things that now are shaping also our understanding of modern cars. We have the horse, which is the power. We have the carriage, which is the luxury. And you can use that analogy and take a Rolls-Royce, a Maybach, as a representation of the carriage, and a Ferrari, oddly enough also with a horse, as the expression of pure power. It's so simple. but it comes from a culture of how we evolved out of the carriage into the mobility. Why do I say this now? Because sometimes it helps to look at old patterns to see where the transformation is really taking place. So let's look at the carriage. This is a carriage with an engine. It's one of the first cars. This is the first car. It looks entirely like something that has been around for hundreds of years. And it was only later, 20 years later, when Mercedes actually developed this car, which was the first one to have the engine in the front. And this is now almost what we see as the typical car. And the typical car was actually for these guys, people who had money, who wanted to have fun, and it was not meant at that point to really become a mass product. So it was technology that was already announcing a change that is possible at a time when cities were drowning in horse poo and horse pee. But it was a niche. And interestingly enough, and I'm saying this because it has a direct relevance to what we see now, the industry that delivered it was still the horse carriage industry. Technology companies built the engines, they built a chassis, and the carriage companies built everything that was on top, the things that look grand and beautiful. So we had different players bringing together cars. And if I may now already make a leap into our time, we can see with electrification that there's a new separation away from the big OEMs and again to different players adding to new small companies that produce modern cars. That's the reason why I'm showing this. And then came Ford. And with Ford came mass production. And mass production, of course, meant efficiency. It means global players who could internationalize. And it was really a statement of what was possible in technology. And this was the birth of the big global corporations. And it was a success, because all of a sudden, in the 1920s, you would see a massive proliferation. Why? Because it became an alternative to the horse. So what is the alternative to our car? That's the question of our time. And then the 1930s, probably a phase of some of the most beautiful vehicles, statements of luxury. In the 50s, statements of middle-class wealth. And then at some point in the 60s, in the 70s, freedom. The car became a statement of, I can go wherever I want. I don't need to adhere to the rules. I'm free to roam. And this is a strong sentiment. And it's a sentiment we also need to understand for our current time. Of course, it became an icon. And this, obviously, being a fatal icon, because James Dean didn't survive this car. But now, it is a lot of what I showed, but primarily, it is the same problem that we had with horse carriages about 100 years earlier. It's an absolute flooding of cities with mass transportation. That's the challenge. But I will give you a few mega trends that I can see that are enforcing this challenge. The affordability, the infrastructure, the performance of the vehicles all made it easy to have them. The costs of having a car and having comfort have come down in relative terms. Now things are possible which, of course, years ago seemed impossible. Sensors, self-driving mechanisms, wellness in the car, massage seats, anything you want. Social pressures are prevalent. In many societies, the car is still considered a statement of social status, but not necessarily something that is seen as an innovation. So this being one, a development that we all know, that is so obvious, let's put it into a context of a few megatrends. And the first megatrend, which to me is almost the most frightening, is human population. Because it has increased in a way as we've never ever seen it on this planet. And this chart shows it all. Since 1918 to our time, the world population, and we're talking 100 years, the population has increased almost eightfold, from 1 million to almost 8 billion, from 1 billion to almost 8 billion. So we can talk a lot about ecological footprints, about CO2, but we have to understand that the issue is we are growing so fast. Can we create the technologies fast enough? And can we manage the complexity well enough that this is not going to collapse? The great thing is connectivity. We can reach people. People are connected to the systems. So there is an international convergence. And we just heard earlier about technology parks in China. Of course, this is something that is happening in one country, but it is becoming global. So those things are helping us on the one side in the positive way of connecting. On the negative side, they're also creating more equality and balance where maybe we haven't resolved the problems underlying it. But I don't want to talk about the environment per se. Let me take the cities. Megacities is what people have been talking about over the last probably 20 years. And the amount of megacities has just skyrocketed. So we see in 2010, 23 cities with about 10 million and more inhabitants, which is about 360 million people living in those cities. In 2025, that number is going to go up by about 75% to 37 cities, with more than 630 million people living in these 37 megacities alone. Already today, more than half of the people live in cities. So when we talk about transportation and mobility, we are very much talking about an urban issue, because this is where the pinch and the pain is the strongest. This is where the requirements to find a solution is the most vital. And you can see the top city, Tokyo, which is no longer a city. It's an urban area which spans several cities and has about 38 million people. Now this means mobility becomes a system, an ecosystem, and that's the opportunity. And as the cities grow and as we have more demand, the ecosystems will become more sophisticated. So air quality, of course, traffic management, space, all those matter. And Tokyo, for instance, developed parking machines under houses in order to actually just cope with personal traffic. Is this sustainable? I bet you, if there are alternatives, they will be used. So what happens today? Very often you see these pictures of microcars being parked in a way you think somebody must have lifted the car up and put it there, because it's almost impossible to get there. But this is the current situation in the biggest city on this planet. And will this have an effect? Of course. We will need smaller cars that can be shared, smaller cars that can disappear in the city fabric, that can pull themselves out. And those are not future scenarios of somewhere in 50 years. This is happening right now. Smart devices is clearly the next one. Who doesn't have a smartphone here in this room? I'm not going to ask, because I would assume it's close to nobody. I came across a really interesting comparison. ENIAC was arguably the first computer in the world. It was used or developed around the Second World War, and it was a big monster. It had tubes, it had welds, it had power requirements, cooling. It was a massive thing that used up some 170 square meters of space. Now hold on. We're talking about 60 years later. That's less than the life of a human. And all of a sudden, in our pocket, and this is 2014, so obviously by now we're somewhere else, the devices we have in our pocket are so powerful. They have so much computing capability. They have so much ability to support complexity that you would not even be able to put all the ENIACs together in one system and fit them on the area of the United States of America. It would be impossible, and we carry them in our pockets, and it's the most natural thing in the world. Now, what does this mean for the mobility? It means all of a sudden, a technology has come in which is the key to so many new forms of using mobility. Coordination, access, and of course, control. And with it, safety and security. So what happened to the status? The car being the expression. Working in the automotive industry and working for luxury brands, I can tell you, it's going down quite dramatically. It will not disappear. So if somebody says car ownership is over, I disagree. There will always be those who want to have it for themselves, made to suit them and to be exclusive to them. So that will exist, but the whole lure is disappearing. And what we can see is new generations simply don't care. And so the sharing is a social trend. It's an acceptance that this status symbol no longer does it for me. And that I'm actually focusing on travels, I'm focusing on, obviously, my device. And this is the first, probably, big purchase for many people. And I'm focusing on the flexibility. And this is a huge transformation, which means sharing is the new smart way of moving around. But without the mobile phone, it would not happen. You wouldn't find the cars, you couldn't open the cars, you couldn't actually pay your trip that you've done. And so all of a sudden, we discover that one thing that was called a phone actually becomes a transformer in the entire automotive industry and in the way that we move around with different places. And one nice example is by a Lithuanian company called Jelby. This is the product they've developed together with the Berlin city, where they're now connecting and combining all forms of transportation. So you see the convergence happening right now. So what are the strict industry trends? This is Mercedes. And Mercedes had a hard time catching up because these guys disrupted everything. What they did is not only create an attractive car, they created a wider view of what it takes to move around with charging stations, batteries, solar panel integration, etc. But they also did one important thing. They actually showed it's fun to drive electric cars. I mean, in the past, it was golf carts, it was, I don't know, some commercial vehicles that were electrified, but they were not fun. So they moved the fun factor into electricity. And electric mobility is clearly right now the trend everyone is moving to. Then, of course, connectivity, of connecting services into the car and connecting the cars to each other and connecting the cars to the city. So all of a sudden, now the cities start playing a role as the mobile phones did in opening it up. And then, of course, autonomous technologies, which will be a big game changer. And they will be a game changer because they allow people to drive seamlessly. Cars can disappear. They don't have to stand around. But at the same time, also, they will take jobs away. And we have, of course, the various winners and losers in this. Taxis will probably suffer. Autonomous shared cars will win. So in this new world, we will see that disruption, that will be driven by essentially 5 big trends. The last one being new manufacturing. This is a sample of a 3D printed mobility pod, so to speak. So what is the impact? One is the utilization will change. Cars that currently run maybe 250,000 kilometers, they will run 1 million because they are used much more often. They don't stand around for all this time. We will be more productive. We will have more time to relax. But at the same time, prices will also come down. It will be cheaper to actually move from A to B, so more people will be moving, possibly. And as I mentioned before, many people will be losing their jobs. Taxi drivers, truck drivers, numerous other services that will be impacted. And there will also be a growing divide between what happens outside of the cities and what happens in the cities. What happens in developing countries and in the fast developing world. So let's quickly get back to the car. The car actually is being reimagined, but only slowly. Remember the very first car that looked like a Carriage? The Tesla looks like a Mercedes or an AMG or whatever you want with an engine in the front. But it's a new animal. It doesn't need to look like that. So now only slowly are we seeing cars that start taking totally different shapes, where you can sit looking inwards and not outwards, and where the cars are no longer vehicles. They become smart devices in themselves, completely connected. And we're seeing the emergence of a totally new kind, the flying cars, which there are numerous startups using technologies that are being developed for the automotive world into a completely new vehicle type. So where is this taking us? New emergent business models, ride-hailing, ride-sharing, all of those are opportunities to take part. You don't need to live in a country with an automotive industry to be part of the transformation of the automotive industry. The next one is the MultiNodal Models of how they all fit together so that people can seamlessly move around. And when you are in a place where you have production, industrial production, you will see cars will not be built by big factories, but they will become like skateboards. And you can then go back to the old pattern, put on top whatever you want, of course, within regulations. So we will see the automotive industry developing more and more modules and the tier 1 suppliers becoming more important. And we will see smaller suppliers design cars that are more regional, more specific to special uses, and more innovative. And, of course, technology transfer into the military just as well. But the key right now is the battery technology. Without that improving, all of that is still going to be very expensive and also difficult for our environment. So this is the one bottleneck. Once that bottleneck is gone, electrification is going to explode. And car manufacturers now are already thinking, so what happens if you move from A to B, not on 4 wheels, but differently? This is Aston Martin. It's a small company, and they are producing their vision of flying cars. I don't call them flying taxis. And earlier I talked about roads, water, I talked about rails. All of this is history. But what is happening now is we're seeing a similar revolution that is only beginning, which is we're leaving the road and going into another medium on a mass scale. And I'm convinced when governments catch up, the lure and the convenience and what it opens up as an opportunity is going to be too powerful that person aerial traffic is not going to happen. So Dubai, for instance, is already one of those countries, cities in the UAE that is being very bullish. They want to have this as a technology for their own image, their own identity, and they're pushing ahead. So we will see those patterns, and we will see those technologies come forward very fast. And they use a lot of the technologies coming out of the cars, autonomous, radar, data processing, the connectivity technologies, all of it benefiting autonomous flying cars. So, I'm almost at the end. What we will also see in the cities, and this is where we get back to the infrastructure, is totally new buildings, new hubs that these aerial vehicles will connect to the multi-node, to public transportation, to cars. And this is an image that Uber created of new hubs, the new train stations, so to speak, where everything comes together. Flying, you have subways below. And is this going to happen? We will see. But it is for sure a very powerful image of how we're going to be moving in the city center. And once the costs are balanced, the benefits are clear. You hop within minutes from spaces. And you might even hop to your country house and no longer live in the city. So it will have an impact way beyond just the city traffic. So, and this is almost it, we see a transitional evolution, or actually a transitional revolution that is happening right now. We see technologies coming together, and they're not owned by the big corporate players of the past. New competitors are coming up, and that's opening up huge opportunities, as you all know, to actually be part of it. It's a radical redesign of the entire logic of how mobility is being delivered. And finally, we see new mobility forms moving forward. So what's the next big game changer? I can only imagine that once we start beaming each other around the planet or the galaxy, then we will really have the next big phase. Until then, I think we have a lot of other exciting things coming up. Thank you.
Very much for your presentation and taking us through the world of the automobile and automotive sector. Much appreciated. Unfortunately, we don't have any time at this moment to take any questions, but you'll be around?
I'll be around for about another 25 minutes.
Okay, for another 25 minutes. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a burning question, please approach Mr. Ungerer.
Thank you so much.
Once again, thank you so much. Okay.